Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So, it's been a while since we've had a nice prison deck on Budget Magic, where our goal is to just make our opponent miserable, lock them out from doing anything relevant. So this week we are heading to Modern to play a deck I'm calling Nevermore. As you can see, $97 in the paper world, 25 ticks on Magic Online, which is a pretty sweet price for a super unique and interesting deck. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break down Nevermore for Modern. If you enjoy Budget Magic and the other series here on the channel, it would be awesome of you if you could click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. We're almost to 100,000 subs. You can help us get over that hump. Anyway, let's break down Nevermore for Modern. So, the idea of this deck is almost like free win red. We're trying to cut our opponent out of outs. So we're going to try to make it so our opponent just can't really do anything relevant, can't really kill us in any way, and then we can win the game at our leisure. So two of the key pieces of the deck are Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention. So these are cards that allow us to name a card and it can't be cast. So ideally, we're going to be naming the key pieces from our opponent's deck. Gideon's Intervention has the additional upside that it can deal with something on the battlefield. So if our opponent, I don't know, has 3 Goblin Guides on the battlefield, which are going to come down before we get down Gideon's Intervention, we can play it named Goblin Guide and it still prevents the damage because of its second ability. So the idea here is kind of twofold. First, we use these cards to generally cut our opponents out of outs. A lot of our cards in our important lock pieces are enchantments, so we want to name enchantment removal. Nahiri the Harbinger, Wear Tear, stuff like that. So cut our opponent off of outs that could kill our enchantments, and then cut our opponent off of their win conditions and things that can potentially kill us. These two cards are especially key against spell-based decks. We have lots of ways of dealing with creatures and even non-creature permanents to some extent, but these are the cards that let us not die to Conflagrate, not die to Lightning Storm, not die to Ad Nauseam, things like that. So we want to try to focus as much as possible these cards on non-creature, non-permanent based win conditions, because we can deal with creatures and permanents in other ways. Not that we won't name creatures and permanents with these if we have to, but ideally, we're going to name things that our other stuff can't deal with. So this is kind of key piece number one, locking spells out of the game, locking answers to our other lock pieces out of the game. And then to kind of support this package, we get a little janky, but we have telepathy and peek, which lets us see our opponent's hand. Seeing our opponent's hand isn't 100% necessary. It's helpful in some situations, especially when we're not exactly sure what our opponent's up to, but against tier decks, we kind of have a pretty good idea already what we should be naming. If our opponent's playing deck Jund, their outs are likely going to be Abrupt Decay to kill Nevermore, Maelstrom Pulse to kill our stuff, and so forth. Liliana the Veil to Ultimate, things like that. So we kind of know against tier decks, but it is helpful to know exactly what's in our opponent's hand. It helps us name better with Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention. So Telepathy is kind of bad because it's card disadvantage. We're playing an enchantment that doesn't do anything other than let us see our opponent's hand, but it's actually incredibly powerful to know what's in our opponent's hand all the time. And we do have some enchantment matters synergies, so telepathy is a little bit better than it would be in most decks because it does support some of our other cards. Peek, on the other hand, pretty low opportunity cost. Basically, you get Taxian Probe that costs the mana, essentially. Also instant speed. But another way we can get a one-shot look at our opponent's hand, write everything down so we know what they got going on, kind of keep track of it, and improve our namings on Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention. So the second part of the deck is being able to deal with creatures, and here we have Ghostly Prison and Sphere of Safety. So the idea of this deck, really, when it comes right down to it, is we can use Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention to take care of non-creatures, and then Ghostly Prison and Sphere of Safety are going to make sure we're not dying to creatures. So Ghostly Prison makes it cost 2 to attack with any creature. Sphere of Safety, since we have Telepathies, Nevermore's, Gideon's Intervention, Ghostly Prisons, is often like 5-10 mana to attack with a creature. So pretty much, once we start stacking these effects on the battlefield, we just lock creature damage out of the game altogether. Of course, the downside is our opponent can kill them and then kill us. If we're trying to stay alive against a huge board of creatures, course, against a Nahiri the Harbinger, our opponent can just Nahiri minus it, Sphere of Safety, but that's where Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention come in to lock out those outs that could deal with our Sphere of Safety, so the packages kind of support each other. Nevermore, Gideon's Intervention pump up our Sphere of Safeties and Ghostly Prisons. Sphere of Safety and Ghostly Prison allow us to name spells and answers with Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention and not name creatures because we can deal with creatures in other ways. The rest of the deck, we have a bunch of enchantment-based removal. Journey to Nowhere is our cheapest removal spell. Gets rid of something in the early game. Detention Sphere, non-conditional, also helpful against a board full of tokens of the same type. Cast Out, a little bit expensive, but being an instant is relevant. Also can cycle it away if we're trying to hit our land drops in the early game. Then we have some spell-based removal. Condemn, Path to Exile. We got a 2-2 split. So really, 4 Path to Exile would probably be better, although Condemn is very good against Death Shadow, and Death Shadow is very heavily played at the moment. But having a 2-2 split is mostly a budget consideration. We were getting close to the max budget as it was, so we couldn't really afford 4 paths and everything else. So I think this mixture is fine, especially since we have Journeys to Nowhere, Detention Spheres to deal with other things that might be sitting out on the battlefield, and Condemn is still another instant speed removal spell if our opponent's pumping Death Shadows and stuff. Very helpful there. One Day of Judgment to sweep things away. We don't need that many rests because we can kind of hard lock go wide decks with our enchantments anyway, but it's nice to have it as a hedge to just sweep away the board. Spreading Seas is our main plan against Tron decks. So we can cast these in the early game, they cycle, they also support our Sphere of Safety, and they're taking our opponent off Tron lands, also keeps us from dying to random creature lands and so forth. And then we have our finishers. So our finishers are Aetherling and Elspeth Sun's Champion. Aetherling was a staple in Standard at one point. It's pretty expensive, but it's also one of the most unkillable threats to finish a game in the format. I can't really think of any ways that someone can get rid of an Aetherling. I guess there's Pithing Needle. If you can keep Aetherling from activating its abilities, you can deal with it. But beyond stopping Aetherling's abilities with a Pithing Needle, it's just so hard to kill if you leave mana up. If your opponent has a removal spell, you can blink it. If your opponent has an Ensnaring Bridge, you can make it small enough to get in under the bridge, then pump it back up to deal a bunch of damage. It closes out the game in like 2 or 3 attacks. So it's just a great finisher in this deck because we're planning on going super long anyway. We're planning on locking things. Eventually, we'll get to a point where even if our opponent has counter spells, we can name the counters with Nevermore. No matter what our opponent could possibly have, we're going to have it locked out of the game. Then we just Aetherling and swing in and finish off the game. Elspeth lets us close out the game fairly quickly as well. Also, a little bit of a bonus by killing the big creatures with the -3, but mostly we just play it, pump it 3 times after we have the game kind of in hand, and then ultimate it, swing in with a whole bunch of tokens, take over the game with our 3/3 flyers. As far as the mana base, we get a bunch of blue-white duels, including Temple of Enlightenment, which is actually pretty sweet in this deck. We don't have much real card advantage or card filtering, so it's nice to be able to kind of scry an extra land to the bottom, scry a non-land to the bottom when we need a land, Ghost Quarters again for Tron, and then some basic lands. As far as the sideboard, so one of the things with this deck is we will run into matchups where our enchantment creature stuff, Ghostly Prisons, Sphere of Safeties, aren't very good. But in these matchups, we can take out most or all of our Ghostly Prisons, our Sphere of Safeties, bring in negates and dispels. Those matchups are mostly spell-based combo, and also some control decks that aren't really winning with creatures so much, more on the Planeswalker plan. So bringing in these cards over the Ghostly Prisons and Sphere of Safeties give us much more action in those matchups. Plus, we kind of have this natural weird hate where if our opponent's playing a combo, they're not going to be expecting to get Gideon's Intervention or Nevermore in game 1, and we still have all those cards in game 2, game 3, so we can trade out our bad enchantments for good counters to go with our good enchantments, which are insanely good. Nevermore and Gideon's Intervention can beat decks like Ad Nauseam pretty much by themselves, and they do it in such a great way because the opponent can't even cast the spell. So not only can we name counter pieces, but then we can name their answers, whatever they're going to use to kill the combo piece or bounce the combo piece, to just guarantee that our opponent can't win. Like imagine against a Storm deck, we name Past in Flames, and then we name Echoing Truth, which would be their way to deal with our Nevermore Gideon's Intervention. It's going to be incredibly hard. Maybe the next one goes on a Grape Shot, and then our opponent just not going to have a way to get through that lock. As far as the rest of the sideboard, we get a bunch of stuff for aggro as well. So against very fast decks, some of our Nevermores and Gideon's interventions are just a bit too slow. We still leave in some of them, usually, but if we're playing hardcore Zoo deck, Revolt Zoo, that's looking to Goblin Guide, Burning Tree, Bushwhacker, instead of leaving in 4-mana enchantments, we can bring in Condemns, Timely Reinforcements, Blessed Alliance, things that deal with creatures, gain us life, give us some chump blockers, and then Disenchant, kind of just an all-purpose card. And that is Nevermore for Modern, and that's our Budget Magic deck for this week. So I think this deck is super sweet. As far as how competitive it is, it's a little slow, a little clunky, but it's really powerful. If we can get our right draws and kind of stabilize, we really can just lock every relevant thing our opponent could possibly do out of the game. So it's really unique and fun to play. If you like the free win red deck, I kind of see this as like free win white. This is kind of the budget equivalent to free win red. It doesn't have all of the powerful lock pieces. It doesn't have Chalice of the Void, doesn't have Ensnaring Bridge, but since we're white, we do get good replacements in Sphere of Safety and Ghostly Prison, but the theory of the deck and the way the deck plays is kind of the same. It's about knowing your opponent's deck, knowing what threats and answers your opponent has in their deck, and then cutting them off one by one in a timely manner, sometimes with the help of Telepathy and Peek to know what's in the opponent's hand, and then using a couple of big finishers that are hard to deal with to just close out the game once the game's in hand. So it's a deck that really teaches you the format and rewards you for having a knowledge of the format and knowing, oh, this is Grixis Death Shadow. These are the cards that we have to worry about. This is Jund. This is Affinity. What do we need to be naming in these matchups to be able to cut off all of our opponent's threats in ways to win the game, as well as all their answers in ways to deal with our stuff. So I think it's a really unique way to play and really fun. It can struggle against super fast decks, also can struggle against some very heavy control decks, I think, that can just counter a lot of our relevant spells. There's also just weird things that get us. Something like an Ugin coming down and sweeping away all of our enchantments is really bad. There's not a lot of mass enchantment removal in Modern, but there are a few things like Ugin that can just really get us super hard, and there's not much we can do about it. But a lot of the time, we have the pieces, if we can name them correctly and play them in the right order, that we can lock out just about any deck from the game. So I think it's really neat and really fun, and I really had a blast playing it. Anyway, that's Nevermore for Modern. That's our Budget Magic deck for this week. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, take a second and click that like button down below. It's a great way to help support the channel for free, and you can find the next video in the playlist right here.